I did a lot of work on CTE, when that was first starting to kind of burst into the public's consciousness.
You made your way to from the sort of the newspaper and magazine world to ESPN. You were there for 16 years as a reporter for ESPN's Outside the Lines. What were some of the memorable stories and projects that you worked on while you were there?
There was a lot. I used to joke like just once, give me like a puff piece. Like, are the Rams going to have a good secondary this year? And that never happened. For people who aren't familiar with Outside the Lines, it's kind of like what the name implies. It was not stuff that happened on the field for the most part. I did a lot of work on CTE, when that was first starting to kind of burst into the public's consciousness. Um, I did a piece with Derek Krammer, the NFL quarterback, who, we don't know if he had, he's alive, and you can really only diagnose CTE in people who have died. They study the brain, but I think there's a chance that Kramer may have it, or at least at minimum have brain damage. I think that's a pretty safe guess. But he had a lot of tragedy in his life, and he actually tried to kill himself in a hotel room in Calabasas, California, and miraculously lived. And I did the first on camera interview with him, and it was incredibly poignant. And he's doing great. That was really powerful. I did a story on Joe Paterno's program, like 5 years before all the Sandusky stuff surfaced. They had a bunch of players that were getting in trouble with the law. It was becoming like really obvious that there was something wrong with the football program at that time. Paterno was about 80, 81, I think, at the time we did the piece. And a bunch of guys were getting arrested. Some were getting charged. Some were pleading guilty. Some charges were dismissed. But we did a piece kind of looking at the whole series of events and interviewed the president, interviewed some former players, interviewed Paterno. And that was probably the single most memorable interview of my career. He accused me of being on a witch hunt. That's the word he used, because we had a lot of data about how many guys had been arrested and charged, and to me, it was kind of a badge of honor a little bit, that because I knew we weren't on a witch hunt. So the fact that he said it, I kind of saw it as a badge of honor a little. And then I talked to a local reporter a couple weeks later, and he said he accused reporters of being on a witch hunt like once a week. So it wasn't quite, And the weird thing is that we really hit it off while we were chatting before the cameras went on. But one thing about Outside the Lines, and also about me, frankly, is we were really, really, really scrupulous about having our facts straight. I was almost psychotic about not going on the air with stuff unless I thought we had it nailed down. And I had really good bosses, like really serious journalists. And sometimes I would even go to them and say, we don't have it yet. So it was great working at Outside the Lines for 16 years. It was an honor. And some people think, that show was kind of the gold standard for sports journalism, maybe along with like HBO Real Sports, did a lot of great work. So there were a lot of memorable pieces.
To that point, I mean, what is it? What's the importance of having trusted sources and doing all that research, and then also, how do you develop a relationship with a source to make sure that they can actually really that they can really help you, and that there's a real relationship between the two of you, and sort of that trusted piece between the two of you?
Well, first you have to do a lot of research, like this, to make sure that the person that you're thinking of having as a source is credible, because people can BS you. I wrote a book about firefighters, and I very aggressively stayed away from the guys who I heard were just like good storytellers. And I went instead to the ones who had like won medals for saving lives, because I didn't want people that were good storytellers. I wanted people that were honest And so same thing, as a reporter for Outside the Lines, you have to do some due diligence. And then, trust is just people, if you have integrity, if you are honest, most people can sense that and will begin to trust you. I did some stories with sexual assault survivors for Outside the Lines. And, their trust is everything because they're going on national television with you to be seen and to be heard. Sometimes they feel like maybe a university turned their back on them, or the cops didn't turn their back on them, but maybe didn't have enough evidence to move forward. And so they went on Outside the Lines, and it was very cathartic. But they have to trust you, A, and B, you have to do diligence about their story, and make sure that they're being straightforward. So, for me, my reputation as a reporter was probably the most important thing to me. I never cut a corner. I just, if I didn't feel good about the story, I wouldn't sign off on it, period. So,
Well, were there situations where you had to have that conversation with a producer or maybe one of the hosts at ESPN that really wanted the story, and you're like, no, we're not. This is something that we just can't. We're not going with this.
not the host. The host was Bob Lee, and he was tremendous. Not really. I mean, it was a good staff. I had a producer once who was kind of a punk, frankly. And we were doing a story with a sexual assault survivor who was, she was in college. She was on a water polo team in college. She had been assaulted under the water during a high school water polo game because she was on a boys' team. She was that good, and a boy on another team touched her in a very inappropriate way. And that was one of those sensitive stories. And my producer, without asking the athlete's permission, wanted to send a camera crew to her college practice and shoot, so B-roll basically, without asking her, telling her, or without getting the team's permission, the coach's permission. And I got wind of it, and I said, no way. And he said, what are you getting at? And I said, I'm getting at, you can get her thrown off the team. She's swimming, and the coach looks up, what the hell is ESPN doing here? And he didn't understand it. So I went to my boss, and I said, this isn't happening. And my boss agreed. That was the most egregious kind of ethical breach, I think, where the guy did not care about her, frankly. Just wanted good B-roll. But for the most part, I had really strong, he was not a supervisor. My supervisors, the ones who made the final calls, were tremendous. A guy like Vince Doria, who was the sports editor of the Boston Globe during its heyday. People like that were at Outside the Line.